Thanks, Tom. When Tom invited me to speak today, he gave me the brief to give the backstory to how I came to be appointed to write the volume I did in the Vietnam series, and something of my experience in writing that volume. So I think the point to start is by saying that my experience of writing a volume was the result of a chance meeting with the then Chief of Air Staff, as our Chief of Air Force was then known, back in about late 1990. This was Air Marshal Ray Fennell. At that stage, I had spent the previous 2.5 years in the Office of the Chief of Air Staff with the title CAS Historian, and I was working on a volume of dealing with the first 2 decades of the RAAF's existence. It was my introduction in making the transition from being an Army historian to being an Air Force historian. But at that point, I'd finished the writing of the volume, and I was remaining in the CAS position while I was putting the book through publication. And that was the time to appear in March 1991. Then I was due to go back to my substantive Australian Public Service position in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, because I'd only been seconded from there. Well, Ray Fennell, as many of you would probably know, is one of the more intellectual chiefs the Air Force has ever had. He was certainly interested in anything to do with the history of Air Force and air power, although he wasn't the chief that actually initiated the volume that I'd been working on for Air Force, which became published as The Third Brother. He had set up the Air Power Studies Centre, as it was first called, out at RAAF Base Fairbairn, and he'd set a team to work on writing the Air Force's first air power manual. As I said, he hadn't actually commissioned The Third Brother, but as the chief in the chair, he got to write the foreword to it. And he made it very clear there that he was very happy with what I had written. I'd written what he thought as a warts and all history of the Air Force, and so he gave a very favourable foreword to it. And I wasn't at all surprised when I bumped into him in the corridor outside his office one day, and he struck up a very friendly conversation and said, do you really have to go back to PM&C? Isn't there another project you'd like to stay on and do for Air Force? Well, it just so happened that at that time, the Official History Unit at the War Memorial was in the news for some of the reasons that Peter Edwards has already explained. It was copying quite a bit of flack because at that stage, after 7 years in existence, there still wasn't a volume of the series in print. And no work, it had been pointed out that no work had even begun on either the RAAF or RAN volumes in that series. Now, of course, Peter had answered that criticism in the press by pointing out the lack of funds that were limiting the work to proceed. Now, it also happened, he'd mentioned, of course, that it forced him to look for appointing writers or historians outside the War Memorial staff structure. Well, it happened that I knew 2 of those 2 authors, in Professor Peter Dennis and Dr. Jeff Gray. I knew them quite well. I knew they were working on the Malayan emergency and confrontation episodes, writing from their full-time post at ADFA. It also happened that I was associated with the same history department as a postgraduate student, because when I was appointed to work on the RAAF volume, I'd enrolled myself as a PhD student, and I was turning my research for the RAAF into a PhD thesis. I also knew that Jeff had been mentioned as the author of the Navy and Air Force contributions to Vietnam. I think, yes. What I didn't know until yesterday when I was talking to Peter Edwards, that he had already written to the chiefs of Navy and Air Force, asking whether they had writers that they could recommend to undertake volumes in his series. So it actually made me realise that Ray Fennell wasn't being quite as innocent and, encouraging when he asked that question of me in the corridor that day. But it was as a result of what I knew. I sort of timidly put my hand up and said, what about the volume in the Vietnam series? And that's where matters went from. I learnt that my services had been offered to Peter Edwards and accepted. My secondment from PM&C was ended, and early in 1991 I was transferred to Defence and sent out to the Air Power Study Centre at Fairbairn as Historical Fellow. Now the position and title was purely for administrative and pay purposes. My duties were to work full-time at the direction of the official historian. And it was in fact a gift of free resources to the official history project. And I know, Peter, you were always glad to receive that. But I also believe Jeff Gray was relieved to have just the Navy volume to focus on, because I recall him saying to me that there was no one to whom he was happier to relinquish the Air Force volume to. But I wonder whether he had cause to regret that in one sense, because I also remember him saying to me that was I having the same trouble as him in getting records, that in fact it seemed Navy had destroyed the whole swag of their records from the period, and he wasn't quite sure he was going to find enough to write about with Navy. I suppose a lot of you hearing that story would think this was a less than ideal way of appointing an author to an official history project. I'd probably have to agree. I think you always usually preferable to have an interview at least and establish whether the person is up to writing a history project of this nature. I would argue that mine wasn't, of course, the first unusual such appointment. I guess Peter, yeah, that's what I was thinking. And I think I can say I had a modest reputation as a writer of military history at that stage. So I wasn't exactly unqualified to be writing an official history. I think it also would not be denied that the course adopted overcame the problem it was intended to fix, because whereas no work had begun on the Air Force volume in 1991, I'd finished the task in a little over 2 years later and delivered the manuscript. So although I was the last author identified for the original 8 volumes that were planned, though that was later increased to 9, when the RAF in Vietnam was published in 1995, it was actually the 4th volume in the series to appear in print. If there was anyone disturbed at the idea of appointing an historian as a salaried employment of the RAAF and writing about one of the RAAF's campaigns, whether that was a risk to independence or objectivity in the product, that was certainly never expressed to me at the time, and I'm pretty sure that Ray Fennell would not have recommended me to Peter except on the basis that I could be trusted to produce another warts and all account. There was certainly no restrictions or guidance or limits placed on me in how I was to approach the task. The only guidance I was to get or was expected to respond to was that from Peter yourself. Although the Air Power Study Centre was my regular place of work, I wasn't attached to the War Memorial in any way. There were no significant demands placed on my time at the by the RAAF. I did an odd lecture or seminar occasionally, and once edited conference proceedings for them, but the rest of the time was wholly devoted to the official history project, and I think I'd certainly say that's what enabled me to get through the task fairly quickly. There was, I think, about 1993, one occurrence that reflected a concern over whether the official history might be perceived as overly subject to government control, if not actual censorship. I'm pretty sure I'd already handed over my volume when the authors, who weren't formally members of the Official History Unit staff, were informed that copyright of our volumes would be vested on publication in the Commonwealth. I think you, Peter, and Jeff Gray were both a little upset by that, because they were university-based historians giving their services unpaid while working within the tradition of guaranteed academic freedom. That wasn't a concern I felt I was entitled to share. Having worked for the Air Force on a previous project, I always expected that the Commonwealth would have ownership of the copyright on what I was producing for them on this occasion. Provided my moral rights to be always acknowledged as the author was respected, I didn't see a problem. I don't think the links to the RFF compromised the scholarly integrity of my work. I was certainly more impressed with the benefits to be derived from the relationship, notably in the support and reform of resources that my work received. I had an office on a defence secure facility. I was funded when I needed to travel, and that was particularly important because I'd identified material that was located in the US and New Zealand. There were significant parts of the RFF story in Vietnam that required getting access to that material. Particularly in the US, there was material held by the Office of Air Force History in the US, which is at Bolling Air Force Base just outside Washington. And there was also the Historical Records Agency was at Montgomery, Alabama. That meant I needed to get there. Being funded by the RAF, I was able to utilise the RAF courier services that the RFF then operated. And that was a considerable saving to the taxpayer. And I remember even seeing Peter Edwards on one of those flights, so we both benefited from that means of travel. The RFF had already made some very useful steps in preparatory steps in anticipation that an official historian would eventually come looking for records. And that was very helpful to me because I was a sole writer without any research assistance. And it ultimately ensured that the Air Force volume was completed expeditiously. A couple of years before I even came on the scene, I believe probably the War Memorial had convinced the Air Force to send a wing commander around Australia collecting oral history interviews with RAF Vietnam veterans. Now these were being taped, sent to the War Memorial for transcription, and they were steadily becoming available to me. And that was an enormous benefit because they'd hit all the major senior commanders of the squadrons that were sent there, senior officers back in Australia as well. So there was I'd had a considerable saving of time with all these interviews that were already there and available for me. The RAF historical section, as it then was, had also brought together many of the most useful records relating to air operations in Vietnam into Canberra and put them in handy locations for me. A lot of them, like airborne records, were already available in the RAF historical section at Russell, but there were a whole metre shelves of material that had been put in a locked cage in the basement of Campbell Park offices. And that's really, that was an enormous burn. Particularly there were not just the unit history records that had been sent back from the units in Vietnam, but there were the monthly reports by commanding officers. So while the unit history records, it was a requirement that had been placed on Air Force units since the 1920s to provide a monthly report on their activities day to day. That was a tremendous narrative available. You could track individuals, date, incidents of note, and all that sort of thing. And also giving you a running commentary on the statistics of sorties, mounted, availability of aircraft, all that sort of information. The CO's reports, on the other hand, contained all the issues. What were the problems they were having? And they were essential records, really, for writing this sort of thing. I'm mentioning this now because I think I would have probably been the last historian who's going to have had that benefit. It has always been a battle to get RAF units to meet their obligation, even though it's entrenched in instructions. COs are not necessarily always diligent in doing that these days. They plead too many other commitments. Certainly CO's reports are not submitted in the same way. And I think the nature of RAF commitments, the way we've been committing RAF units, has changed for recent conflicts. And quite often you're seeing smaller elements being put into mixed units. So who do they report to? They certainly don't report back to Air Force. They're certainly not putting back historical reports. The other thing, of course, is whereas in Vietnam we committed whole squadrons, these for Iraq and Afghanistan, quite often there have been detachments of units that have stayed back here in Australia. So again, there's no reporting mechanism in place to actually achieve a similar record-keeping exercise as we had in Vietnam. I feel that working from a base within the Department of Defence, but under the direction of the official historian, wasn't as bad an arrangement as it might appear. It was something I wasn't anxious to emphasise at any stage. I always wanted to make it clear that I was working for the official historian. So whenever I was invited to attend staff meetings or workshops, staff lunches or other social functions, always made the best effort I could to get there, to be part of it, and to hold regular consultations with Peter Edwards as we discussed progress, plans, difficulties being encountered and how to overcome them. I also passed through draft chapters as I produced them for comment and criticism. And I always made the effort, at least, to listen to all the advice received. And I remember one example. Peter asked me to come up with some ideas on what to call my volume. So that must have been sometime probably in about 1994 when the edited book was destined for the printer. And thinking on the volumes that were already in the pipeline for this, I thought something double-barrelled, like, crises and commitments. I thought something like that would be appropriate. And I think I suggested to Peter Caribous to Canberras to reflect the progression of the RAF commitment from Caribou transport aircraft to Canberra bombers. And quick as a flash, Peter responded that it made it sound like the book was a treatise on the Canadian meat trade with Australia. So that's why we ended up with the unambiguous title, The RAF in Vietnam. As I said earlier, being a security-cleared public servant in the Defence Department with an office on secure defence premises also played a part in making the arrangement work. It smoothed the process of getting access to certain records. For example, when I wanted joint planning committee records, Defence Committee, I had no trouble getting these through the archive section. I wasn't exempt, though, of course, in any way from the normal requirement to have drafts security cleared. The only concern that had ever been expressed to me was, could I identify for the archive section which material I was actually going to cite in the records? Because they wanted to get clearance action underway straight away, so that when the book was published, people came asking to see that same material, it would be available. So that didn't seem to be a big problem. When it came to having these drafts vetted, there weren't a lot of objections raised, that are certainly not on security grounds, and those that were really seemed very reasonable for me. They certainly didn't amount to censorship in any way. I remember, well, I can't remember all the problems, but I do remember at one point I had named the Vietnamese linguist who taught defence personnel going to Vietnam at the RAF School of Languages. And I was asked to take that out, take his name out, only because at the time I was writing, this man might have had relatives back in Vietnam and could be placing them at risk following the communist takeover. So it certainly wasn't a big point. Now, I realise that the absence of critical comment might not have been because, or might have been because what I wrote was pretty anodyne and uncontroversial, and perhaps even I self-censored. But I don't think any of the criticisms I received in the 20 years since that book came out suggested that that was the case in any way. I certainly didn't set out to suppress or avoid contentious issues. I certainly probably got about half a dozen responses or letters from people at various times. And I remember getting some phone calls from a particular group of RAAF personnel, airfield defence guards, who felt that I'd treated them rather badly because I had made use of adverse comments, well, not adverse comments, but comments that were appearing in CO's reports, successive CO's reports from the bases where airfield defence guards were used to protect the airfields. There was ongoing concerns being expressed about the fact that these guys were constantly being asked to mount patrols for the security of the airfield, but nothing ever happened. So for these guys, it was a real grind, and of course that placed problems on discipline and morale. So the COs were reflecting that in their reports, and I referred to that. And the groups of former airfield defence guards felt that I had in some way maligned them as a group. So that certainly wasn't my intention. The other letters I got were mainly from people who wanted to comment on certain events in the book. They were concerned that I didn't have the full story in some cases. Rather than I wasn't wrong in what I said, but I hadn't given the full picture. And of course, I think that is a reflection of one of the problems you get when you're writing from official records, that you really only, you think you've only got the right story from what's already there. And sometimes there's a better story than what you actually had. I certainly remember when the RAAF went into Ubon in Thailand in about 1962, and that's an important precursor for the RAF getting involved in Vietnam a couple of years later. There was an incident where the base had been put on full alert, expecting a communist ground attack on the base, and there was an incident and a petrol tank exploded, and they thought we were being bombed. It wasn't anything like that. Somebody had put a flame too close to a petrol tank that was leaking, and that's what it was about. Well, I had the individual who had been pointed to as the person responsible, who wrote and told me and said, no, that's not quite what happened, and here's the full story. So, you know, I've kept all those because I thought if ever this volume went into a second edition, there'd be the opportunity to do what Bean did and, you know, put some corrigenda of updates on it. And there was another incident where a caribou had crashed into the sea at the end of a runway, and again the concern was that the facts hadn't been fully presented or fully covered in the official account. So I think, as I say, I think that explains there are instances that explain privileged access to the official records isn't the only answer. You quite often have to go and seek the personal experiences of people who were there. But of course, if you first have to realise or have a suspicion in the back of your mind that these gaps are in the records, to go looking, because quite often these people won't come to you and offer up the fact that they know a bit more about the story than you do yourself. There's really only one incident that I recounted in the RAF in Vietnam, where I would have liked to have changed what I originally wrote in light of information that came to light in recent years. And that concerns the loss of Canberra A84-231 in November 1970, which produced the RAAF's 2 missing in actions in Vietnam. They were listed as MIA for nearly 40 years. And when I wrote about this episode, I recorded the events as they were understood at the time, and the loss remained an unresolved mystery. Even though there were claims that emerged in the mid-80s, the whole thing still remained uncertain what had happened. It took an imaginative hunch by DSTO scientists in 2009 to prompt a search in a different area to that which had originally been searched back in 1970. This was inspired by the Aussies Home campaign that was mounted at that time to bring all the Australian MIAs back, and had been successful for the 4 Army personnel. There was only the 2 RAF men involved left. And eventually, by working out where the aircraft could have come down if it hadn't exploded mid-air, which was the theory that predominated at the time from all the interviews I'd been able to carry out and everything that was in the records, they assumed it had either been hit by enemy action or had suffered some sort of catastrophic mid-air event. But they worked out, well, if it had just come down to ground on its own steam, where was it likely to land? And the DSTO scientists said, look there. So they looked there and it was located 40 years later. It was discovered that the aircraft had been going at full speed when it flew into the ground. It was on a night bombing mission, and there was certainly no evidence that it had been hit by ground fire or anything like that. That episode, I think, highlights the difficulty that official history usually is only reflecting what's in the records again, and unless there's some reason to dispute or to discount that, that's what you've got to work with. I certainly didn't and couldn't at the time that I was writing find any grounds or a basis to dispute what was there. And I'll just give another example of that, which I do mention in the book. There was a situation that arose when the Vietnam Memorial on Anzac Parade here was opened in 1992. It had 3 concrete benches put out around it, recording the names of missing in action. Now, one of those benches had the names of the 2 RAF airmen who'd become MIA. But the date shown that they went missing was a day apart. Now, that is a mistake that could only have occurred through the RAF casualty reporting system. So it was an error that was in the RAF's own official records. So people using the official records, of course, had been led into a simple error like that. It was not long after those remains were brought back to Australia. I was talking to Air Marshal David Evans, who was a former commander of Canberra bombers in Vietnam, and he raised the view that everyone would assume that it was probably pilot disorientation that was behind that episode. It's a recognised trap for airmen. Whenever you lose your horizon, you have no idea really in which direction your aircraft is actually the attitude it's at. And especially on a night operation. I mean, we know about this, about whiteout effect when aircraft are flying in snow or Arctic condition. Quite often you lose the horizon. But at night, of course, it's an equal problem. And if you ever see photographs of the inside of a Canberra bomber, on night operations, you've got these small dials lit with red light. So it's probably very easy for pilots to lose sense of the fact that, in this case, the aircraft was actually on a slow decline and they'd been descending all that time under full power and they went straight into the ground. Now, if I'd been an airman myself, rather than an army trained person, I might have been more alert to that possibility. But all I can say, it was never raised in any of the reports from 1970.
Chris, I'm
Yep.
afraid you have to stop.
Okay.
And that leaves us with little time for questions, because, to be honest, nothing they could ask could be more interesting than what you've told them. But can I ask you to thank Chris for a fascinating insight?